Welcome to another journey through the great events that shaped the history of humanity. Before we begin, if you are passionate about history and want to continue learning with in-depth and rigorously researched content, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and leave your like. Your support helps us continue producing quality educational material. Now, get ready to delve into one of the most tense, complex, and defining periods of the 20th century, the Cold War. The divided world. Imagine a planet split in two. Not by a physical line, but by an invisible barrier of ideologies, fears, and nuclear arsenals capable of destroying all life on Earth several times over. For almost 5 decades, humanity lived under the shadow of a conflict that never escalated into direct war between the two superpowers, but which set dozens of nations ablaze, cost millions of lives, and completely redefined the world order. This is the story of the Cold War. The term Cold War was popularized by the American journalist Walter Lippmann in 1947, although the writer George Orwell had already used it in 1945. The expression perfectly captures the nature of this conflict, a war fought on every imaginable front, except for direct military confrontation between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a war of espionage, propaganda, arms races, technological disputes, proxy wars, and, above all, a battle for the soul of the world. To truly understand the Cold War, we need to go back in time and understand how two nations that fought side by side against Nazism became mortal adversaries in a matter of years. It is a story of mutual distrust, imperial ambitions, genuine fear, and catastrophic misunderstandings. It is also the story of how humanity came dangerously close to total annihilation and, somehow, managed to retreat from the abyss. The roots of the conflict, the fundamental ideological antagonism. The seeds of the Cold War were planted long before 1945. In fact, we can trace its origins back to November 1917, when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, seized power in Russia and established the world's first socialist state. From the outset, communist ideology preached the inevitability of world revolution and the overthrow of capitalism in all countries. This was not merely an abstract theory, but an active policy. The Communist International, or Comintern, founded in 1919, had the explicit objective of coordinating and promoting communist revolutions around the globe. The Western powers reacted with alarm and hostility. Between 1918 and 1920, American, British, French, and Japanese troops intervened in the Russian Civil War, supporting the anti-communist forces known as the White Army. This intervention failed to overthrow the Bolshevik government, but it left deep scars on the Soviet memory. Soviet leaders would never forget that the capitalist powers had tried to strangle their state in its cradle. During the 1920s and 1930s, the Soviet Union remained largely isolated from the international system. The United States only diplomatically recognized the Soviet government in 1933, 16 years after the October Revolution. Fear of the Red Menace permeated American society, manifesting itself in the First Red Scare of 1919 to 1920, when thousands suspected of communist sympathies were arrested or deported. Joseph Stalin, who consolidated his absolute power over the Soviet Union after Lenin's death in 1924, ruled with an iron fist. The Stalinist purges of the 1930s eliminated millions of people, including most of the old Bolshevik Guard and a large part of the Red Army's officer corps. This brutality confirmed, in Western eyes, the tyrannical nature of Soviet communism. On the other hand, the Soviets viewed the capitalist West with equal distrust. They saw Western democracies as hypocritical systems that concealed economic exploitation under a facade of freedom. The Great Depression of 1929, which devastated capitalist economies while the Soviet Union advanced in its forced industrialization, seemed to confirm the Marxist analysis that capitalism was doomed to collapse. The unlikely alliance of World War II. The rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism in Germany created a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, Hitler was virulently anti-communist and made it clear that the destruction of Jewish Bolshevism was one of his primary objectives. On the other hand, Western democracies, especially Great Britain under Neville Chamberlain, seemed more willing to appease Hitler than to form an alliance with Stalin against him. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, shocked the world. It included secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, allowing both totalitarian powers to expand their territories at the expense of smaller nations. Stalin hoped this agreement would buy him time to strengthen his armed forces and that Germany would exhaust itself in a war against the Western powers. The German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, shattered these calculations. Overnight, Stalin went from being Hitler's accomplice to an ally of the Western democracies. Winston Churchill, the staunch anti-communist who led Great Britain, famously declared, "If Hitler were to invade hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, known as the Big Three, was always a partnership of convenience, not conviction. Mutual distrust permeated all interactions. Stalin constantly suspected that his Western allies were deliberately allowing the Soviet Union to bear the brunt of the war against Germany, hoping that both totalitarian powers would destroy each other. This suspicion had some basis in reality. The opening of the Second Front in Western Europe, repeatedly promised by the Western Allies, was postponed from 1942 to 1943 and finally to 1944. During this time, the Soviet Union alone faced the brunt of German military power, suffering catastrophic losses. It is estimated that 27 million Soviet citizens died in World War II, a number that far exceeds the combined losses of all other Allied countries. The war conferences and the shaping of the post-war period. As the tide of war began to turn against Germany, the Allied leaders began planning the post-war world order. 3 summit conferences, in Tehran, 1943, Yalta, February 1945, and Potsdam, July-August 1945, attempted to harmonize the often conflicting objectives of the three powers. At the Yalta Conference, held in Soviet Crimea as the Red Army advanced inexorably toward Berlin, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin made decisions that would shape the world for decades. They agreed to divide Germany into occupation zones, create the United Nations, and hold free elections in the countries liberated from Nazi rule. The Declaration on a Liberated Europe, signed in Yalta, promised that liberated peoples could create democratic institutions of their own choosing through free and unhindered elections. This language, however, meant very different things to the signatories. For Roosevelt and Churchill, free elections meant multi-party competition in the Western model. For Stalin, democracy meant regimes that were not hostile to the Soviet Union, which in practice meant communist governments or governments dominated by communists. When Harry S. Truman succeeded Roosevelt after the latter's death in April 1945, and Clement Attlee succeeded Churchill after the Labour victory in the British elections of July, the dynamics between the Allies changed significantly. Truman was more distrustful of Stalin than Roosevelt had been, and less inclined to make concessions to maintain the alliance. The Potsdam Conference, held in the ruins of defeated Germany, revealed the growing rifts among the Allies. Truman informed Stalin of the existence of a new weapon of unprecedented destructive power, without mentioning that it was an atomic bomb. Days later, on August 6 and 9, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ushering in the nuclear age. The use of these weapons against Japan had profound implications for relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets interpreted the bombings not only as a means of ending the war against Japan, but as a show of force intended to intimidate them. Stalin ordered the acceleration of the Soviet nuclear program, determined to eliminate the American atomic monopoly as quickly as possible. The Iron Curtain is falling. The Sovietization of Eastern Europe. In the months following the end of World War II, the Soviet Union consolidated its control over Eastern Europe through a combination of political pressure, intimidation, electoral manipulation, and, when necessary, brute force. Although the tactics varied from country to country, the result was uniformly the establishment of communist regimes subordinate to Moscow. In Poland, the government in exile in London, recognized by the Western powers during the war, was sidelined in favor of the Lublin Committee, dominated by communists and sponsored by the Soviets. The promised elections in Yalta were repeatedly postponed and, when finally held in January 1947, were grossly rigged. The Polish Workers' Party claimed an overwhelming victory amid widespread intimidation and the imprisonment of opposition leaders. In Romania, the presence of the Red Army allowed the communists, who before the war numbered fewer than 1,000 members, to gradually take control of the government. In March 1945, Soviet Deputy Minister Andrei Vyshinsky traveled to Bucharest and gave King Michael a 2-hour ultimatum to appoint a communist-dominated government, threatening that refusal would result in the end of Romania as an independent state. In Bulgaria and Hungary, similar processes unfolded. Initially broad coalitions were progressively narrowed as non-communist parties were intimidated, divided, or banned. Opposition leaders were imprisoned, exiled, or assassinated. By 1948, all Eastern European countries, with the exception of Yugoslavia and Albania, had become de facto Soviet satellites. Czechoslovakia presented a particularly shocking case. This country had a strong democratic tradition and a genuinely popular communist party, which had won 38% of the vote in free elections in 1946. However, when it seemed that the communists would lose support in the elections scheduled for 1948, they staged a coup in February of that year. The weakened and pressured President Edvard Beneš yielded to communist demands. Weeks later, Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, son of the founder of the Czechoslovak Republic, was found dead under the window of his apartment, officially a suicide, almost certainly murdered. The Prague coup had a huge impact on Western opinion. If even democratic Czechoslovakia could be swallowed up by communism, no country seemed safe. This event dramatically accelerated efforts to form a Western defensive alliance. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. On March 12, 1947, President Harry Truman addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress. His speech, which would become known as the Truman Doctrine, marked a fundamental shift in American foreign policy. Truman declared that the United States would support free peoples who are resisting attempts at subjugation by armed minorities or by external pressures. The immediate context was the situation in Greece and Turkey. In Greece, a bloody civil war pitted the monarchist government, supported by Great Britain, against communist insurgents. In Turkey, the Soviet Union was pressing for territorial concessions and control over the straits linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Great Britain, exhausted by the war and facing a severe economic crisis, informed the Americans that it could no longer maintain its commitments in these regions. The Truman Doctrine represented the definitive abandonment of the isolationism that had characterized American foreign policy for most of its history. The United States now assumed the role of global defender against communist expansion, a commitment that would last decades and cost trillions of dollars and millions of lives. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive economic aid program for the reconstruction of Europe. The Marshall Plan, as it became known, offered assistance to all European countries, including the Soviet Union and its satellites. Stalin, however, refused Soviet participation and forbade Eastern European countries from accepting American aid, seeing the plan as an attempt to extend American economic and political influence over Europe. Between 1948 and 1952, the Marshall Plan channeled approximately $13 billion, equivalent to about $150 billion in today's values, into Western Europe. This massive injection of capital, combined with economic reforms and the opening of markets, triggered a spectacular economic recovery. Western Europe not only rebuilt itself from the ruins of war, but laid the foundations for decades of unprecedented growth and prosperity. The Marshall Plan also had profound political implications. By linking economic recovery to European cooperation, it encouraged the integration that would eventually lead to the creation of the European Community and, later, the European Union. By demonstrating the benefits of the Western capitalist model, it helped stabilize fragile democracies and marginalize communist parties in France and Italy. The Berlin Blockade, the first great crisis. Berlin, the former capital of the Nazi Reich, found itself in a peculiar geographical situation. Located more than 160 kilometers inside the Soviet occupation zone, the city had been divided into 4 sectors controlled by the Americans, British, French, and Soviets. Western access to Berlin depended on land and air corridors through Soviet-controlled territory. In June 1948, the 3 Western powers introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their occupation zones and sectors of Berlin. This monetary reform, carried out without consulting the Soviets, aimed to stabilize the economy and curb rampant inflation. Stalin saw the measure as a step towards the creation of a separate West German state, something he was determined to prevent or, at least, use as leverage. On June 24, 1948, the Soviet Union imposed a total blockade on West Berlin, cutting off all land and river routes to the city. 2 million inhabitants of West Berlin were isolated. With food and fuel supplies for only a few weeks, the United States faced an agonizing dilemma. Enforcing the blockade with land convoys risked a direct military confrontation with the Soviets, potentially triggering a Third World War. Abandoning Berlin would be a humiliation that would encourage Soviet aggression elsewhere. The solution found was audacious: to supply the city entirely by air. The Berlin blockade, also known as the Berlin Airlift, was one of the most impressive logistical operations in history. For almost a year, American and British planes landed in Berlin at intervals of just minutes, 24 hours a day, bringing food, coal, medicine, and all other supplies necessary to keep the city alive. At the height of the operation, a plane landed every 30 seconds. The operation was a technical triumph and a propaganda coup for the West. West Berliners, who just a few years earlier had been enemies, were now portrayed as courageous defenders of freedom against Soviet tyranny. American pilots dropping candy from parachutes to the children of Berlin became symbols of American generosity. Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May 1949, tacitly acknowledging the failure of his strategy. Far from dividing the Western Allies or forcing them to abandon Berlin, the blockade had accelerated the creation of NATO and the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. The division of Germany into two states, which Stalin had tried to avoid, became a reality. The formation of military alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington on April 4, 1949, created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known by the acronym NATO. The 12 original members, including the United States, Canada, Great Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, pledged to treat an attack against any member as an attack against all. Article 5 of the treaty, which established this guarantee of collective defense, was the heart of the alliance. For the first time in American history, the United States formally committed itself to defending European allies in peacetime. This was a radical departure from the isolationist tradition that George Washington had articulated in his farewell address, warning against permanent alliances. The Soviet Union responded to the creation of NATO with furious rhetoric, denouncing it as an aggressive alliance directed against it. In reality, Stalin was not surprised. He had anticipated some kind of Western defensive alliance and, in a sense, his own policies in Eastern Europe had made such an alliance inevitable. The formal Soviet response came in 1955 with the creation of the Warsaw Pact. This military alliance grouped the Soviet Union with its Eastern European satellites, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Albania. The pact formalized military arrangements that already existed in practice and provided a legal justification for the presence of Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. Europe was now divided into two heavily armed military blocs, prepared for war. The dividing line, which Churchill had described in his famous 1946 speech as an Iron Curtain, stretched from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic. The nuclear age and the arms race. The end of the American atomic monopoly. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in Kazakhstan. The news, announced by President Truman in September, shocked the American public and fundamentally transformed the nature of the Cold War. The American nuclear monopoly had lasted only 4 years. During this period, American strategists had counted on the atomic bomb as a counterweight to Soviet superiority in conventional forces in Europe. Now, this advantage had evaporated. Both superpowers possessed the capacity to inflict catastrophic destruction on each other. The Soviet nuclear program had benefited significantly from espionage. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist who became a British citizen and had worked on the Manhattan Project, passed crucial information to the Soviets. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American citizens, were convicted and executed in 1953 for atomic espionage. Although espionage accelerated the Soviet program, Soviet scientists like Igor Kurchatov were able to develop nuclear weapons independently. The stolen information simply saved time and resources. The American response to the Soviet test was to develop an even more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear bomb. While atomic bombs derived their energy from the fission of heavy atoms, the H-bomb used the fusion of hydrogen atoms, the same process that powers the sun. Its destructive potential was almost limitless. On November 1, 1952, the United States tested the first thermonuclear device at Inuitak Atoll in the Pacific. The explosion, with a yield of 10.4 megatons, was 700 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Elyaghlab Island was completely vaporized. Less than a year later, in August 1953, the Soviet Union tested its own thermonuclear device. The nuclear arms race had truly begun. Over the following decades, both superpowers would amass arsenals of thousands of nuclear warheads, enough capacity to destroy human civilization multiple times over. This concept became known as overkill. the ability to kill all human beings more than once, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. As nuclear arsenals grew, strategists on both sides developed doctrines for thinking about nuclear war. The most important concept that emerged was that of mutually assured destruction, known by the acronym MAD, which coincidentally means mad in English. The logic of MAD was both simple and terrifying. If both sides possessed sufficient capacity to devastate the adversary even after suffering a first nuclear attack, then neither side would have an incentive to start a nuclear war. The first to attack would be destroyed in retaliation. The only rational strategy was not to attack. This logic depended on the concept of a second strike or retaliatory capability. If one side could destroy the adversary's nuclear forces in a first strike, eliminating its ability to respond, deterrence would fail. Therefore, both superpowers invested enormously in making their nuclear forces survivable, capable of surviving an attack and retaliating. Nuclear submarines armed with ballistic missiles became the backbone of this second strike capability. Silent and virtually undetectable, constantly patrolling the world's oceans, these submarines ensured that even a devastating surprise attack could not eliminate the ability to retaliate. Strategic bombers kept on constant alert, and missiles based in hardened underground silos complemented this nuclear triad. The MAD doctrine created a paradoxical situation. The security of both superpowers depended on their mutual vulnerability. If one side developed effective defenses against nuclear missiles, it could theoretically launch a first strike without fear of retaliation, destabilizing the entire balance of terror. For this reason, the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty severely limited defensive systems, codifying mutual vulnerability as the foundation of strategic stability. Arms races and moments of danger. The arms race was not limited to nuclear weapons. Both superpowers developed vast conventional forces, including millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of tanks, thousands of fighter jets, and global naval fleets. NATO and the Warsaw Pact maintained hundreds of thousands of troops facing each other along the border between the two Germanies. Military spending consumed enormous portions of national budgets. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union dedicated an estimated 15 to 25% of its GDP to military expenditures, a burden that would eventually contribute to its economic collapse. The United States spent proportionally less, but in absolute terms its defense budgets were astronomical. The arms race included the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons systems. Intercontinental ballistic missiles could hit targets thousands of kilometers away in less than 30 minutes. Multiple independently targetable missiles, known as MIRVs, allowed a single missile to destroy several cities. Low-altitude cruise missiles could penetrate air defenses. Each technological advance on one side provoked countermeasures from the other. There were times when nuclear war seemed imminent. In September 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite mistakenly detected the launch of 5 American missiles against the Soviet Union. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, judged it to be a false alarm, reasoning that a real American first strike would involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. His decision not to report the warning as a genuine attack may have prevented a nuclear war. Petrov was initially reprimanded for violating protocol, but later recognized as the man who saved the world. In November of the same year, the NATO exercise called Able Archer 83 simulated an escalation to nuclear war with such realism that Soviet leaders feared it was cover for a real attack. Soviet forces were placed on high alert, and nuclear bombers were prepared for takeoff. Only when the exercise ended without incident did the tension subside. Espionage, propaganda, and the war of SHADOWS, the world of secret services. The Cold War was fought not only by soldiers and diplomats, but by spies. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, created in 1947, became the main instrument of American covert operations. Its Soviet equivalent, the KGB, Committee for State Security, was a vast organization responsible for both foreign espionage and internal repression. Cold War espionage involved some of the most audacious and technologically sophisticated operations in history. Tunnels were dug beneath Berlin to intercept Soviet communications. Spy satellites photographed military installations from orbit. Submarines infiltrated territorial waters to gather intelligence. Reconnaissance planes flew over enemy territory at altitudes believed to be unattainable. One of these flights ended in one of the most embarrassing incidents of the Cold War. On May 1, 1960, an American U-2 spy plane, piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over the Soviet Union. The Americans initially claimed it was a stray weather plane, but Khrushchev revealed that they had captured the pilot alive and the spy equipment intact. The incident destroyed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev and poisoned relations between the superpowers. The spy war was also waged through human agents infiltrated into the heart of enemy power structures. Kim Philby, a high-ranking British intelligence officer, was revealed in 1963 to be a longtime Soviet spy, part of a group of agents known as the Cambridge Five. Aldrich Ames of the CIA and Robert Hanssen of the FBI passed vital information to the Soviets for years before being discovered. On the other side, Oleg Penkovsky, a colonel in Soviet military intelligence, provided crucial information to the West during the Cuban Missile Crisis before being captured and executed. Psychological warfare and the battle for minds. The Cold War was also, fundamentally, a war of ideas. Both sides invested enormously in propaganda, striving to convince the world that their system was superior. Voice of America, created during World War II, continued to broadcast programming in dozens of languages to audiences behind the Iron Curtain. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, secretly funded by the CIA, broadcast news and commentary to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, offering an alternative to state-controlled media. Listening to these stations was risky, but millions of Soviet and Eastern European citizens did so regularly. The Soviet Union responded with its own broadcasts, through Radio Moscow and other stations, as well as funding communist parties and front organizations around the world. Soviet propaganda emphasized themes such as American imperialism, racism in the United States, and the injustices of capitalism. Culture became a battleground. The CIA secretly funded cultural magazines, art exhibitions, and jazz musician tours as part of an effort to demonstrate the vitality and freedom of American culture. The Soviets responded with their own cultural programs, highlighting the achievements of Soviet ballet, classical musicians, and Olympic athletes. Sporting events, especially the Olympic Games, became showcases for competition between systems. Each gold medal was claimed as proof of the superiority of capitalism or socialism. The medal count was scrutinized as if it were a scoreboard in an ideological war. The space race represented perhaps the most spectacular form of competition for prestige. When the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in October 1957, the shock in the United States was profound. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, they could also launch nuclear missiles against American cities. 4 years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space, another Soviet triumph that seemed to demonstrate the technical superiority of communism. The United States responded with determination. President John F. Kennedy pledged the nation to land a man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. This goal was achieved on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface while the world watched. The American conquest of the moon was an unprecedented propaganda coup, a feat the Soviets never managed to match. Proxy wars and regional conflicts. The Korean War, the first armed confrontation. The first major proxy war of the Cold War broke out on the Korean Peninsula on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. Korea had been divided at the end of World War II, with the Soviets occupying the North and the Americans the South. Two antagonistic states had emerged, each claiming to represent all of Korea. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung convinced Stalin to support an invasion to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. Stalin, wary of a direct confrontation with the United States, only gave his approval after obtaining assurances that Communist China would also support the operation. The North Korean invasion was initially devastatingly successful. Within weeks, South Korean forces and the few American advisors present were pushed back to a small perimeter around the port of Busan. The fall of South Korea seemed imminent. The United States, however, intervened under the banner of the United Nations. A Security Council resolution authorized military action to repel North Korean aggression. This resolution was only possible because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Council in protest against the refusal to grant the Chinese seat to the Communist government in Beijing, and therefore was not present to veto the measure. General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the UN forces, executed a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, behind North Korean lines, in September 1950. The maneuver was a spectacular success. North Korean forces were cut off from their supply lines and collapsed. Within weeks, UN forces had not only liberated South Korea but advanced deep into North Korea, approaching the border with China. Communist China, alarmed by the presence of American forces on its border, intervened massively in November 1950. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers attacked UN forces, forcing an agonizing retreat into the brutal Korean winter. Seoul was recaptured by the Communists in January 1951. Before being retaken in March, the war settled into a bloody stalemate around the 38th parallel, roughly the original dividing line. MacArthur, frustrated by the political restrictions that prevented him from attacking China directly, was dismissed by Truman in April 1951 for insubordination. The war continued for another 2 years, with fierce battles over hills and positions that repeatedly changed hands. An armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, after Stalin's death and Eisenhower's election. The border remained essentially where it was before the war, but the human cost was horrific, approximately 2.5 million dead, including civilians, in addition to millions of refugees and separated families. Korea remains divided to this day, and technically the armistice was never replaced by a peace treaty. Vietnam, the American quagmire. If Korea was a draw, Vietnam would be a humiliating defeat for the United States. This conflict, which dragged on for more than 2 decades, would demonstrate the limits of American military power and leave deep scars on the national psyche. Vietnam had been a French colony until World War II. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the country was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel, with a communist government in the north under Ho Chi Minh and an anti-communist regime in the south supported by the United States. Reunification elections scheduled for 1956 were never held because the Americans and their South Vietnamese allies feared that Ho Chi Minh would win. A communist insurgency, the Viet Cong, emerged in the south, supported by the north. The United States initially provided advisors and economic aid to the South Vietnamese government, but involvement escalated dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. Following alleged attacks by North Vietnamese boats against American ships, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving President Lyndon Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam. In 1965, the first American combat battalions arrived in Vietnam. In the following years, the number of American troops in the country grew to over 500,000. The United States unleashed a massive bombing campaign against the North, dropping more tons of bombs on Vietnam than all the other powers combined had dropped in World War II. Despite this overwhelming force, victory remained elusive. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong demonstrated a determination and capacity to absorb losses that American planners had underestimated. Guerrilla warfare neutralized many of the American technological advantages. American troops controlled the terrain by day, but insurgents frequently returned at night. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 was a turning point. Although the Communists suffered heavy military losses, the fact that they were able to simultaneously attack dozens of South Vietnamese cities, including the American embassy in Saigon, shocked the American public. The credibility of the government, which had been claiming that victory was near, was destroyed. Opposition to the war grew dramatically. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 in part on a promise to end the war, implemented a policy of Vietnamization, gradually shifting responsibility for the fighting to South Vietnamese forces while withdrawing American troops. At the same time, he expanded the war into Cambodia and intensified the bombing raids. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, allowed for the withdrawal of the last American troops. 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. Images of American helicopters evacuating the last staff from the embassy roof became symbols of American defeat. The cost was devastating. Approximately 58,000 Americans died in the conflict, in addition to hundreds of thousands wounded and traumatized. Estimates of Vietnamese deaths range from 1 to 3 million. The country was devastated by bombings. Chemical defoliants such as Agent Orange, and decades of conflict. Other theaters, Africa, Latin America and Asia. The Cold War was truly global, with conflicts and interventions on virtually every continent. In Africa, decolonization created new, often unstable nations that became targets of competition between the superpowers. Angola plunged into a bloody civil war after independence from Portugal in 1975, with the Soviet Union and Cuba supporting the MPLA, while the United States and South Africa supported UNITA and the FNLA. The conflict dragged on for decades, devastating the country. In Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in 1974 by Marxist military officers who established a brutal regime supported by the Soviets. The war between Ethiopia and Somalia over the Ogaden Desert in 1977–78 saw the superpowers switch allies. The Soviets, who had supported Somalia, switched their support to Ethiopia, while the Americans took over support for Somalia. In Latin America, the United States considered the region its backyard and repeatedly intervened to prevent leftist governments from taking power. The CIA orchestrated coups against democratically elected governments in Guatemala in 1954 and Chile in 1973. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a failed attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba, was a humiliation. Conversely, the invasion of Grenada in 1983 and support for the Contras in Nicaragua reflected American determination to prevent the expansion of Soviet and Cuban influence in the region. In Afghanistan, the Soviet intervention in December 1979 to support a communist government facing a Muslim insurgency became known as Soviet Vietnam. The United States provided weapons and training to the Mujahideen, including Stinger anti-aircraft missiles that neutralized Soviet air superiority. After nearly a decade of brutal war, the Soviets withdrew in 1989, leaving behind a devastated country that would eventually fall into the hands of the Taliban. Moments of crisis and inflection points. The Cuban Missile Crisis. On the brink of the abyss in October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. The Cuban Missile Crisis represented the peak of Cold War tensions and also, paradoxically, the beginning of a process of détente between the superpowers. The crisis had its roots in the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which brought Fidel Castro to power. Castro was initially not an avowed communist, but American hostility and the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 pushed him into Moscow's arms. Cuba became the first Soviet-allied state in the Western Hemisphere. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, decided to install medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. His motivations were multiple: to defend Cuba from another American invasion, to counterbalance American missiles installed in Turkey near the Soviet border, and to gain a strategic advantage at low cost. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft photographed missile construction sites in Cuba. The images clearly showed launch pads for SS-4 missiles, capable of reaching most of the continental United States with nuclear warheads. President Kennedy was informed on the morning of October 16. For the next 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear apocalypse. Kennedy convened a group of trusted advisors, the ExComm, Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to assess the options. The options ranged from diplomacy to military attack. Some advisors, including Air Force General Curtis LeMay, advocated immediate bombing raids against the missile sites, followed by an invasion. Kennedy rejected this option, fearing it would lead to Soviet retaliation against Berlin and possibly nuclear war. The chosen option was a naval blockade, euphemistically called a quarantine, to avoid the legal implications of a blockade, which is technically an act of war. The American Navy would surround Cuba and prevent the arrival of Soviet ships carrying more military equipment. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation in a televised broadcast, revealing the presence of the missiles and announcing the quarantine. The world held its breath. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. American forces were placed on DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached, one step below nuclear war. The following days were filled with extreme tension. Frantic correspondence between Kennedy and Khrushchev sought a way out. On October 27, known as Black Saturday, the crisis nearly escalated into war. A U-2 fighter jet was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. Another U-2 inadvertently violated Soviet airspace. A Soviet submarine, surrounded by American ships and losing contact with Moscow, nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. Only the objection of an officer, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented the launch. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. Secretly, the United States also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey within a few months. Kennedy was portrayed as the victor, but in reality both sides made concessions. The crisis had lasting consequences. A direct line, the famous red telephone, actually a telex, was established between Washington and Moscow to allow immediate communication in future crises. Both sides, frightened by how close they had come to disaster, became more cautious. The 1963 Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which banned atmospheric testing, was a first step towards arms control. Berlin, the wall and the division of a city. Berlin remained a focal point of tension throughout the Cold War. The divided city was an anomaly, a Western enclave in the heart of the Soviet bloc, a showcase of both systems, and an open wound bleeding refugees. Between 1949 and 1961, approximately 2.5 million East Germans fled to the West, mostly through Berlin. This hemorrhage of population, often the youngest and most qualified, was bleeding East Germany dry. The difference in prosperity between West and East Berlin was stark. While the West flourished with the help of the Marshall Plan, the East stagnated under the Soviet system. In the early morning of August 13, 1961, without warning, East German troops and workers began erecting barbed wire barriers along the border between the eastern and western sectors of Berlin. In the following days and weeks, the barbed wire gave way to a concrete wall, guarded by watchtowers and armed patrols. The Berlin Wall became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War, the physical manifestation of the Iron Curtain. Families were separated overnight. People who lived in the East and worked in the West found themselves trapped on the wrong side. Some tried to escape, crossing the wall, swimming across canals, hiding in cars, or digging tunnels. At least 140 people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall during its 28 years of existence. President Kennedy visited Berlin in June 1963 and delivered one of his most memorable speeches, declaring, "Ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner." The speech reaffirmed the American commitment to the defense of West Berlin and condemned the wall as the most obvious and vivid demonstration of the failures of the communist system. The wall remained standing until November 1989, when its fall signaled the end of the Cold War. But this is moving our history forward, the Prague Spring and the limits of reformation. If the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated the dangers of direct confrontation between superpowers, the events in Czechoslovakia in 1968 showed the limits of Soviet tolerance for reforms within its own bloc. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. A reformist by conviction, Dubček initiated a program of liberalization that became known as the Prague Spring. Censorship was relaxed. Political debate was permitted. There was talk of socialism with a human face. The Czechoslovak population responded with enthusiasm. For the first time in decades, writers, artists, and ordinary citizens could freely express their opinions. Independent organizations flourished. Although Dubček remained committed to socialism and the alliance with the Soviet Union, the intellectual and political ferment alarmed leaders in Moscow and in the capitals of other countries in the bloc. Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, and his allies feared that Czechoslovak liberalization would be contagious, inspiring similar movements in Poland, East Germany, and even the Soviet Union. Attempts to pressure Dubček to reverse the reforms failed. On the night of August 20 to 21, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces, led by Soviet troops and including Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, and East German contingents, invaded Czechoslovakia. Approximately 500,000 soldiers and thousands of tanks occupied the country within hours. The resistance was mostly nonviolent. Citizens confronted soldiers with arguments, not weapons. Street signs were removed or altered to confuse the invaders. Clandestine radio broadcasts kept the population informed. Jan Palach, a 20-year-old student, immolated himself in protest in Wenceslas Square in January 1969. Dubček was brought to Moscow, forced to accept the reversal of the reforms, and eventually removed from power. The Brezhnev Doctrine, as it became known, affirmed the Soviet right to intervene militarily in any socialist country where socialism was threatened, effectively declaring that the countries of the Soviet bloc had limited sovereignty. The invasion of Czechoslovakia had a profound impact on the Western left. Many European communists, especially in Italy and France, distanced themselves from Moscow, developing the trend known as Eurocommunism. The illusion that the Soviet system could be reformed from within suffered a severe blow. Détente, crises and renewal of conflict. The age of détente 1970s witnessed a decrease in tensions between the superpowers, a period known as détente, a French term meaning relaxation. Several factors contributed to this change. The United States, traumatized by Vietnam and by internal upheavals such as the civil rights movement and anti-war protests, was less inclined towards global confrontation. The Soviet Union, having achieved near nuclear parity with the United States, felt more secure in negotiating. Both sides recognized that the arms race was economically unsustainable and nuclearly dangerous. President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, devised a strategy of engagement with the Soviet Union and Communist China. Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in February 1972 transformed the triangular relations between the three powers. The United States and China, which had not had diplomatic relations since 1949, began to normalize their relations. The Soviet Union, fearing a Sino-American alignment against it, became more receptive to negotiation. The SALT I agreements, strategic arms limitation talks, signed in Moscow in May 1972 during Nixon's visit to the Soviet Union, were the first nuclear arms control treaty between the superpowers. The agreement froze the number of intercontinental ballistic missile launchers and submarine-launched missiles at roughly equal levels. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 represented the culmination of détente. 35 European nations, plus the United States and Canada, agreed to recognize post-war European borders, including the partition of Germany. In exchange, the Soviet Union accepted clauses on human rights, including freedom of movement and thought. Although these clauses were largely ignored initially, they would provide a legal basis for dissent and eventually contribute to undermining the legitimacy of communist regimes. Space cooperation symbolized détente. In July 1975, an American Apollo spacecraft docked with a Soviet Soyuz spacecraft in orbit. Astronauts and cosmonauts exchanged handshakes and gifts, a spectacle of cooperation that contrasted sharply with the competitive space race of previous decades. The end of détente and the Second Cold War. Détente began to crumble in the late 1970s. Soviet intervention in Africa, supporting Marxist governments in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, alarmed Americans who saw Soviet expansionism where the Soviets saw legitimate support for liberation movements. The decisive event was the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979. President Jimmy Carter, who had bet on cooperation with the Soviet Union, reacted with outrage. The United States imposed economic sanctions, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and began arming the Afghan resistance. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 marked a new phase in the Cold War. Reagan had built his political career in part on virulent anti-communism. He saw détente as a dangerous illusion that had allowed the Soviet Union to gain strategic advantages. His rhetoric was incandescent. In a 1983 speech, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. More than rhetoric, Reagan embarked on the largest peacetime rearmament in American history. Military spending grew dramatically. New weapon systems were developed and deployed. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars by critics, proposed a ballistic missile defense system based in part in space. The Soviets responded with alarm. The Kremlin's ailing system, led by a series of elderly and ailing leaders, struggled to keep up. Leonid Brezhnev died in 1982, followed quickly by Yuri Andropov in 1984 and Konstantin Chernenko in 1985. The Soviet economy, crushed by military spending and systemic inefficiency, was stagnant. Relations between the superpowers reached their lowest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union's downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007 in September 1983, killing 269 people, including an American congressman, further poisoned the atmosphere. The Able Archer exercise in November 1983 nearly triggered a Soviet nuclear reaction. The revolution No1 expctd Mikhail Gorbachev and the transformation of the Soviet Union in March 1985, the death of Konstantin Chernenko brought to power a Soviet leader of an entirely new type. Mikhail Gorbachev, at 54 years old, was young by Kremlin standards, energetic, and, crucially, convinced that the Soviet Union needed fundamental reforms to survive. Gorbachev inherited a system in deep crisis. The Soviet economy, after decades of growth that had transformed a backward agrarian country into an industrial superpower, was now stagnant. Soviet technology was increasingly lagging behind the West, especially in critical areas such as computing and telecommunications. Corruption was endemic. Popular cynicism towards the official ideology was widespread. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and lives with no prospect of victory. Gorbachev introduced two concepts that would transform history: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Glasnost meant greater transparency and freedom of expression. For the first time, the horrors of Stalinism were openly discussed in the Soviet media. Criticism of the government became possible. Political prisoners were released, including the famous dissident Andrei Sakharov. Perestroika aimed to reform the economy, introducing market elements and decentralization without abandoning socialism. In practice, the economic reforms were hesitant and contradictory, often worsening the situation by dismantling central control mechanisms without creating functional alternatives. In foreign policy, Gorbachev revolutionized the Soviet position. He recognized that the arms race was ruining his country and seriously pursued disarmament agreements. In a series of summits with Reagan, and later with his successor George H.W. Bush, historic agreements were reached. The 1987 INF Treaty eliminated an entire class of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe. Negotiations for deeper reductions progressed. Most significantly, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine. In December 1988, he announced at the United Nations that the Soviet Union would unilaterally reduce its forces in Europe and that each country had the right to choose its own path. The countries of Eastern Europe were now free to pursue their own policies without fear of Soviet invasion. The year that changed the world, 1989. The liberation of Eastern Europe happened with a speed that surprised everyone, including its protagonists. The year 1989 witnessed the collapse of communist regimes that had seemed permanent. Poland led the way. The Solidarity Trade Union, founded in the Gdansk shipyards in 1980 and subsequently banned under martial law, had survived underground. In April 1989, roundtable negotiations between the communist government and the opposition legalized solidarity and allowed for partially free elections. In June, Solidarity candidates won a landslide victory in every seat they could contest. In August, Tadeusz Mazowiecki became the first non-communist prime minister in Eastern Europe since 1948. Hungary opened its border with Austria in May 1989. Thousands of East Germans began traveling to Hungary for holidays and, from there, fleeing to the west. The population hemorrhage was reminiscent of the days before the Berlin Wall. Massive protests erupted in East Germany, with crowds marching and chanting, "Wir sind das Volk, we are the people." East German leader Erich Honecker, who had said the Berlin Wall would last 100 years, was ousted by his own colleagues in October. His successor, Egon Krenz, attempted to appease the population with limited reforms. On November 9, a government spokesperson, in a confusing press conference, announced that citizens could cross the border freely. The crowds in Berlin didn't wait for explanations. Thousands converged on the checkpoints. The border guards, without clear orders, opened the gates. East and West Berliners mingled in euphoric celebrations. People climbed the wall and began to tear it down with pickaxes and sledgehammers. Images of these scenes were broadcast around the world, symbolizing the end of an era. In the following weeks, other communist regimes fell like dominoes. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution took Václav Havel, playwright and dissident, from prison to the presidency in a matter of weeks. In Bulgaria, reformists within the Communist Party overthrew the long-serving dictator Todor Zhivkov. In Romania, the revolution was violent. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were captured and summarily executed on Christmas Day. German reunification and the end of the Warsaw Pact. The fall of the Berlin Wall immediately raised the question of German reunification. For 45 years, the division of Germany had been one of the cornerstones of the post-war European order. The prospect of a united Germany, potentially the greatest power in Europe, stirred historical memories and geopolitical concerns. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was openly skeptical about reunification. French President François Mitterrand had reservations. But West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl moved decisively. With American support and, crucially, with Gorbachev's acquiescence, reunification progressed with surprising speed. In October 1990, less than a year after the fall of the wall, Germany was officially reunified. East Germany simply ceased to exist, its states incorporated into the Federal Republic of Germany. It was the first instance of a Warsaw Pact member becoming a NATO member overnight. The Soviet acceptance of German reunification and its continued membership in NATO was the clearest sign that the Cold War had ended. In exchange, Germany pledged to limit its armed forces and finance the withdrawal of Soviet troops from its territory. Gorbachev also received promises, although not formalized in treaties, that NATO would not expand eastward. This issue would become a source of bitter controversy in the following decades. The Warsaw Pact was formally dissolved in July 1991. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, the Soviet trading bloc, was also shut down. The structures that had kept Eastern Europe under Soviet control evaporated. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the liberation of Eastern Europe, was merely the prelude to an even more extraordinary event, the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself. Gorbachev had unleashed forces he could not control. Glasnost, by allowing open discussion, revealed the depth of the Soviet crisis and encouraged demands for more radical changes. Perestroika, by disrupting existing economic mechanisms without replacing them with functional alternatives, worsened living conditions. Shortages of basic goods, endless queues, and rising inflation eroded popular support. More fundamentally, the relaxation of central control allowed long-suppressed nationalist tensions to emerge. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic state composed of 15 republics, many of which had distinct national traditions and historical resentments against Russian rule. The Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, led the way. Annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940 as a result of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they had never accepted the legitimacy of their annexation. In August 1989, some 2 million people formed a 600-kilometer human chain linking the three Baltic capitals, demanding independence. In March 1990, Lithuania unilaterally declared its independence. Gorbachev oscillated between concessions and repression. In January 1991, Soviet troops attacked the television tower in Vilnius, Lithuania, killing 14 civilians. The incident provoked outrage, but did not stop the independence movement. The coup of August 1991 was the turning point. Conservatives from the Communist Party, the military, and the KGB, desperate to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and prevent the disintegration of the country, detained the Soviet president at his holiday residence in Crimea and declared a state of emergency. The coup failed spectacularly. Boris Yeltsin, the democratically elected president of the Russian Soviet Republic in June, emerged as the leader of the resistance. Climbing onto a tank in front of the Russian parliament, he called on the population to defy the coup plotters. Crowds surrounded the building. Military units refused to fire on civilians. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but his power was broken. Yeltsin was now the dominant figure. One after another, the Soviet republics declared independence. In December 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in the Bielorussia forest and declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. In its place, they created the Commonwealth of Independent States, a loosely defined association of sovereign states. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The tricolor flag of Russia took its place. The Cold War was over. Legacy and consequences. The human and material cost. Calculating the total cost of the Cold War is an impossible task, but some dimensions can be outlined. Tens of millions of people died in Cold War-related conflicts, from Korea and Vietnam to civil wars in Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Central America. Millions more were displaced, traumatized, or deprived of basic freedoms. Military spending during the Cold War totaled trillions of dollars. Resources that could have been invested in education, health, and development were consumed by the arms race. The Soviet Union, in particular, distorted its economy so severely in favor of the military sector that it directly contributed to its collapse. The environmental legacy is equally grim. Nuclear tests have contaminated vast areas, from the deserts of Nevada and Kazakhstan to atolls in the Pacific. Nuclear weapons production has left a trail of radioactive contamination at facilities such as Hanford in the United States and Chelyabinsk in Russia. The Soviet nuclear base in Semipalatinsk, Kazakhstan, conducted more than 450 nuclear tests, leaving a legacy of diseases and genetic deformities that persists to this day. Geopolitical transformations. The end of the Cold War redrew the world's political map. The Soviet Union gave way to 15 independent states. Yugoslavia, another multi-ethnic state that had remained united in part by external pressure from the Cold War, disintegrated in bloody wars in the 1990s. Czechoslovakia peacefully split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993. The United States emerged as the sole global superpower, enjoying unprecedented unipolarity. Intense debates began about how to use this power. Some advocated for a new world order of international cooperation and the promotion of democracy and human rights. Others saw an opportunity to consolidate American primacy. NATO's eastward expansion, incorporating former Warsaw Pact members and even former Soviet republics, was one of the most consequential decisions of the post-Cold War period. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. The Baltic states and others followed in 2004 and later. Russia, initially too weak to resist, never accepted this expansion as legitimate, seeing it as a betrayal of promises made to Gorbachev. The ideological legacy. The collapse of Soviet communism was widely interpreted in the West as definitive proof of the superiority of liberal democratic capitalism. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously declared, "The end of history," arguing that liberal democracy had triumphed as the final form of human government. This triumphalist narrative proved premature. The transition from communism to capitalism in Russia and other countries was often chaotic and painful, marked by economic collapse, growing inequality, and oligarchization. Nostalgia for the Soviet period, unthinkable in the euphoric years of 1989 to 91, became commonplace. China demonstrated that the collapse of communism was not inevitable. The Chinese Communist Party, having brutally suppressed pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in June 1989, maintained its political monopoly while liberalizing the economy. The Chinese model of authoritarian capitalism presented itself as an alternative to both Soviet communism and Western liberal democracy. Nuclear weapons in the post-Cold War world. The end of the Cold War did not eliminate the nuclear threat. Thousands of warheads remained in American and Russian arsenals. The collapse of the Soviet Union created new concerns about the security of these weapons and the possibility that nuclear material could fall into the hands of terrorists or rogue states. 3 Former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, inherited nuclear weapons. Under American pressure and with security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom formalized in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, they agreed to transfer the warheads to Russia and adhere to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear states. The Ukrainian decision to relinquish its nuclear arsenal would be bitterly regretted by many Ukrainians after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of 2022. Arms control efforts continued, with treaties such as START I, 1991, START II, 1993, and the New START, 2010, reducing American and Russian nuclear arsenals from their Cold War peaks. However, these efforts stagnated and eventually regressed in the 2010s, with the United States and Russia withdrawing from key treaties and modernizing their arsenals. An armed peace, a transformed world. The Cold War was the defining conflict of the second half of the 20th century. For nearly 5 decades, it shaped international politics, influenced the lives of billions of people, and repeatedly brought humanity to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Its peaceful end, without the apocalyptic war that so many had feared, was one of the most pleasant surprises in modern history. However, it would be a mistake to view the Cold War as a closed chapter in history. The tensions it generated, the patterns of thought it established, and the resentments it left behind continue to influence international relations. The conflict between Russia and the West, which intensified from 2014 onwards with the Ukrainian crisis, has deep roots in the post-Cold War order and in Russian perceptions of having been deceived and humiliated. The rivalry between the United States and China, which has become the central axis of international politics in the 21st century, echoes in many respects the competition of the Cold War. Once again, two superpowers with different political and economic systems are vying for global influence, although the economic entanglement between them is incomparably greater than that between the United States and the Soviet Union. Lessons from the Cold War. What can we learn from the Cold War? First, that nuclear deterrence, however terrible, seems to have worked in preventing a third world war. The certainty of mutual destruction focused minds and imposed caution even in moments of greatest tension. However, deterrence depended not only on arsenals, but on communication, mutual understanding and, in critical moments, on the courage of individuals who rejected the logic of nuclear automatism. Secondly, dysfunctional political and economic systems eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The Soviet Union was not defeated militarily, it imploded because it failed to offer its citizens either material prosperity or political freedom. Systems that rely on coercion and lies to maintain themselves may endure for decades, but they are not sustainable indefinitely. Third, profound historical changes can happen in unexpected ways and at unexpected times. Very few observers in 1985 predicted that the Soviet Union would cease to exist within 6 years. The choice of a reformist leader, Gorbachev, triggered a series of events that no one fully controlled. History is not predetermined, it is made by human beings making decisions in circumstances they did not choose. The memory of the Cold War. For those who lived through it, the Cold War was a formative experience. Generations grew up with nuclear attack drills in schools, aware that the world could end at any moment. This existential anxiety permeated the culture, from science fiction films about nuclear holocaust to the protest songs of the Vietnam era. For generations born after 1991, the Cold War is history, as distant as the world wars or colonial imperialism. This distance can lead to a misunderstanding of the fears and motivations of past eras. It can also lead to complacency regarding the dangers that still exist. Nuclear arsenals remain. Rivalries between great powers persist. The misunderstandings and mistrust that nearly led to catastrophe during the Cold War could be repeated. The history of the Cold War is not merely a chronicle of past events, it is a warning about the dangers of the future. Conclusion: the world the Cold War made. As we conclude this journey through nearly 5 decades of history, we contemplate a world profoundly shaped by the Cold War. The military alliances it created, from NATO to the network of American bases around the world, remain. The borders it drew or consolidated, from the Korean partition to the Soviet successor states, continue to define political geography. The technologies it spurred, from satellites to the internet, have transformed the daily lives of billions. More profoundly, the Cold War left a legacy of ideas and attitudes. The tension between order and freedom, between security and human rights, between national sovereignty and global interdependence, which fueled so many Cold War debates, continues to shape political thought. Questions about the appropriate role of the state in the economy, about the limits of intervention in the affairs of other countries, about the balance between openness and protection, were not definitively answered by the end of the Cold War. They merely took on new forms. The Cold War reminds us that history doesn't end. Every conflict resolution plants the seeds of future conflicts. The world that emerged in 1991 was not an end point, but a new beginning. The decades since then have seen new rivalries, new crises, new challenges that no one in 1991 fully anticipated. Understanding the Cold War is therefore essential not only for understanding the past, but for navigating the present and shaping the future. The mistakes made, the opportunities missed, the moments when wisdom prevailed and those when it did not, all contain lessons for generations facing their own global challenges. You have reached the end of this journey through the history of the Cold War. We hope this content has enriched your understanding of one of the most crucial periods in contemporary history. If you value in-depth and rigorously researched educational content, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos about the great events that shaped our world. Share this video with colleagues, students, and anyone interested in history. Together, we can keep the memory of the past alive and learn the lessons it offers us. Until the next historical journey.